everyone, Dan here from Front End Adelaide. Much like everyone else, we've been running a bunch of our stuff virtually this year. Recently, we ran a set of lightning talks from great local speakers. Lucky for you, we recorded it. So coming up is Scott Cabot with Three.js. It's easier than you think. Hope you enjoy.
So I've got the honor of setting the bar for the presentations this evening. So if this is a train wreck, the other presenters can thank me in Slack at the end of the night. Hopefully it's not a train wreck, but we'll see how we go. So as Dan's mentioned, I'm going to be talking about 3D on the web tonight. So thank you for coming to my talk entitled Loading Objects in Three.js. It's easier than you think. So for those of you who don't know what Three.js is, it's a JavaScript library for rendering 3D natively in your browser. So if you're a JavaScript developer, it will be fairly familiar to you. Because it's plain JavaScript, it's also fairly portable. So there are abstractions over the top of this like React 3 Fiber. I won't be talking about that tonight, but that seems like a very popular abstraction over the top of this. If you have never heard of Three.js before, you might be wondering why you would want to use it. The first answer is just you can be creative. You can do some really cool stuff in 3D. And so if you want to explore that, then you should. It's very accessible insofar as because we can now do these things natively in the browser, you can give your users or your customers, whomever you're sort of targeting, really rich interactive experiences without maybe having to have them go download a native application, which is what they would have had to have done 12 months ago, 18 months ago. So you can really do, I guess, sort of quite frictionless onboarding for people in 3D. And because you're doing things in a canvas, you're not restricted by the DOM, right? I appreciate people can do some amazing things with CSS and HTML, but when we've got the power of the canvas, we can do things that are just highly interactive. I suggest that you go and have a look at some of these demos on the Three.js website. As far as a library goes, their documentation's great. As you can see here, they've got a ton of example code and it's constantly evolving. So if this is something you think you might be interested in, please look at it after this talk. This is aimed at beginner to intermediate JavaScript developers. I will be spending some time in code. I'm hoping it's high level enough that even if you don't do it regularly, you'll be able to take something away from it. So we'll see how we go. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Scott. I'm a full stack developer here in Adelaide. I work for a company called Tap2. As always, I'd just like to thank them for their support. Even lightning talks take quite a bit of effort to make. They do for me at least. They always seem to involve a live demo. So having an employer that's sort of willing to be supportive of that and let me sort of polish these things up at the last minute on work time and things like that is really valuable. So thank you. As far as my experience in 3D goes, I've released 6 apps on app stores. 5 of those were self-published. And then I worked as part of a larger team with the team out at Odd Games for Trucks Off-Road. And congratulations to them. Last time I checked, the app had over 1 million downloads on Android. So great to be part of a product that's done so well. More recently, I've released a micro walking sim called Hope. This is available for Windows PC. You can see a link up the top there. It's available on itch.io. You don't need to be a gamer to play this. You can literally just turn on auto walk and just read the text. Please play it if you haven't. I'd love to hear your feedback. Reach out to me on Slack. It helps me grow as an individual. And it's also one of the reasons that I sort of choose to make games, right, is to share them with other people. This is an example of what you can do in Three.js. Please ignore the lighting. GIF renderers don't, interpolate light very well. This is a live interactive demo on my website. If you go to scott.cab, there's an example there in my sort of demo section called stickers. This is an interactive 3D diorama where you can play with a few bits and pieces and sort of see all these stickers that I've collected from dev events when they were live events. And of course, my laptop is still pristine, and that's the way it's going to stay. So that will evolve, but it really is a good example of what you can do quite quickly with Three.js in the browser. So I implore you to check that out as well. So why am I doing a talk on object loaders? Why are they valuable? And I guess what's been my experience, right? So a lot of my talks are experiential. What am I hoping I can teach you so you don't have to go through sort of the same pain that I did? This is 4 lines of code that comes from the Three.js quick start. And again, the quick start is fantastic, but I guess if you've never done 3D, these 4 lines might scare you a little bit. So I'll just go through them quickly just so I guess we understand what's going on. So the first line is we're creating a geometry. So those are the vertices relative to the local space of that object, right? So a box has like 8 vertices. We then create a material. The material defines how that thing is represented on the screen when it's finally rendered. So in this instance, we're just setting the color to green. But you imagine that more complicated materials that also have shaders do things like tell you how bumpy the surface is, or how reflective the surface is, or whether it should inherit shadows, right? So we need to define those two things. The combination of those two things creates a mesh, and then we add that mesh to the scene. Now, in this instance, that's fine because Three.js has provided a lot of these primitives out of the box for us, right? So we can just say, give me a cube, give me a box geometry. But if you want to do anything that doesn't involve a box, then what do, right? That's the scary bit, especially if you've never done 3D before. You might feel like you have to make all these things programmatically or like through code. And that's probably the worst way to do it, quite frankly, unless you have a need to do procedural generation. Of course, there are tons of games that do that. You don't want to be using code to do these things. You want to use a more appropriate tool, and that's what we're going to look at today. So we're going to get Threezy now. So the rest of the demo is going to be in the browser and in my IDE. So again, if you have JavaScript experience, I'm hoping you can glean a lot from that today. And then at the end, we'll come back and we'll go through a sort of a few keys for success if you want to try this after this talk. So this is the demo that Three.js gives you. It is a spinning cube. It's a unit cube, so it's 1 by 1 by 1. It sits at the world origin 0, 0, 0, and it spins on 2 axes. And the quick start is so good you can just copy paste it and serve up the file, and it just works, and you feel amazing. But then you need to edit it, and then what? What do you do now? So I'm not going to go through my code too much. I have adapted the quick start to use Webpack and a few other bits and pieces. I've tried to set this up so it's got some basic responsiveness. I've really tried to create a starter kit so that you can go away after this talk and use it, right? So I don't want to go into too much of the specifics. For those of you that are interested, though, the absolute, minimum building blocks you need for something in Three.js is a scene and a renderer, and then you attach that renderer to the DOM, and you're pretty much good to go. By default, nothing will render, of course, unless you're pointing a camera at it. You'll just get a blank scene. And then the quick start is telling us to create this cube. So this is my first time using Three.js, let's pretend, and I just want to muck around with cubes for a bit. So how could I add a second cube? All right, well, I can go up here and I can copy this. I can make this cube 2. Maybe I can make this cube 2 and this cube 2. Depending on if you've got this full screen and if your video quality is very good, you might be able to tell that there is another cube sitting there in the middle of that first cube, right? It's also at the world origin and it's not spinning, but like this is pointless. This is not a useful cube. That's not exciting at all. So maybe let's try to move it. I hate typing when people are watching and there's so many people watching. Oh my goodness. All right, so let's move the cube. So that's a little better, right? Now at least it's not in the other cube. But I'm sort of just flailing around with numbers here. I don't really know if that works, and it's not spinning. All right, so let's make it spin. Let's maybe grab these, make it spin. No typos, Scott, you can do it. So that's more attractive, but there's a lot of trial and error going on here, right? I've got a very limited perspective insofar as my camera's looking from a fixed perspective. And I really sort of have to try to build this 3D scene in my head, which is quite difficult to do, and then adjust the numbers appropriately. So you can see very quickly this gets quite prescriptive. And of course, I've already changed like 5 lines just to move a cube. So this is not going to be scalable, right? So the quick start is good. The documentation has alternatives, but I just don't think they're highlighted super well if you don't know what to look for. So that's what we're going to do now. And that's using an object loader. So let's get rid of my changes, change branches. So this is an example of a scene that I've built very quickly, but I haven't built it in code in sort of the way they've suggested. One of the things that we want to do, obviously, is use an object loader. So what tool would we use, I guess, in order to facilitate this flow? Well, we'll use a 3D modeling program. So in this instance, I'm going to use Blender. It's a free open source tool, and it's phenomenal. Every major version, it gets better. Of course, if you're familiar with something else, so Maya, 3D Studio Max, whatever, there is probably an object loader that supports your 3D tool of choice. But I'm just going to use Blender for today's example. So we'll open my scene. And why am I advocating for something like Blender? Well, of course, this is a fit for purpose tool, right? This is a tool for making 3D things. So we have more intuitive tools, more ways to debug it. And quite frankly, we can work visually. So again, this might be hard to see depending on your video quality. I've added a light to the scene. which again, you can see here, the top left light is quite bright. Lighting doesn't translate one-to-one, so they're not perfect, but lighting is quite bright here and it's quite dark on the right-hand side. The same is true in my Blender scene. My camera's no longer facing sort of straight on either. It's on this nice angle. And in fact, I can even frame my scene. So immediately I have a much better way of understanding where my cubes need to sit relative to the camera or to the world, right? If I decide I need to move this cube for some reason, I can just move it, right? So let's say I like that. I've just moved that 2.247 meters. If I was tweaking numbers by like 0.001 and hitting save and refresh in my browser, I would get angry really quickly, right? So let's say that's a good framing for my scene. Now what would I do, right? Again, this is my workflow. We'll discuss how you might want to change yours. But I'm just going to select every item in the scene, going to export my file. I like to use the GLTF file format. Again, we're using Blender, we're using Three.js. Why not use an open format for our model as well? I'm going to save it as a text file. The reason I'm doing that is it will just diff better in Git. My experience coming from Unity, when Unity was highly binary based, was when you had to diff binary files, you always sort of forget which one's current and which one's incoming, right? And you just sort of have to sometimes break a rebase or something to work out what's going on. If it's in plain text, you've often got markers you can just skim through and be like, oh, I remember changing that property, or I remember changing that thing's size, like this has to be the right one, or, you know, I added all these objects. It's very obvious my file's changed. So I try to work in plain text when I can. I'm going to only export selected objects. I have obviously selected all of them. If I'm working on a project that has lots of little diorama scenes, I might just save them all in the one Blender file. So whatever, I'm just going to take the selected objects, cameras and lights, everything else can stay as default. And I'm just going to override the scene that I already have here. And you'll see that it's updated, right? So I haven't had to muck around with any code here. I've been able to work really visually, which if you want to do something highly creative, I think is sort of the right medium for that. And I've got some instant response in my browser, so that's fantastic. But how are we doing that now in code, right? Of course, we've decided we're going to use an object loader. We want to move away from the way we were doing it before. Because I've chosen to use Webpack, I can use ES6 syntax here. There are ways that you can do this just normally without using Babel or doing any build steps, things like that. They've got that in their documentation. I'm using an instance of a GLTF loader here. So again, Three.js provides object loaders, but they provide them for different file types. So based on your workflow or your process, find the right loader for you. In this instance, I'm just using an import statement for it. If you were to be doing it manually, you would probably literally just download the JavaScript file off their GitHub, put it somewhere in your project that you know where it is, and require it or do whatever you're going to do to use it. And the loader is very simple. We give it a path to our model. That's the one I just saved over before out of Blender. So I've just got a models folder in my source directory. And then we get a callback function that says, cool, you've got your object. What do you want to do with it? Pretty much. And again, I'm doing a few extra bits and pieces here, but the only things we really care about, lines 49, I'm just going to assign the camera that I had set up in Blender to the camera in Three.js. Right? So now I don't have to do things like, what should the field of view for my camera be? What should the aspect ratio for my camera be? What's the near and far clipping planes? I don't really have to worry about that. I can just set that up in Blender, again, visually, not think about it too much, and just have those transfer over. But the real secret sauce here is I can just take the entire scene, all those files that I exported out of Blender, and just plop them straight into the scene in Three.js, and it just works, right? So now we have a workflow where ostensibly it's infinitely scalable, right? Like I can make the biggest or smallest scene that I want. I can maybe change my file path or whatever, but I now have a workflow where I can just rapidly iterate on my scene. And as you saw here, change it in a matter of, minutes while I'm explaining it, but seconds if you're sort of just at home mucking around and trying to get creative. What if you don't know how to use Blender, or what if you don't want to learn how to make 3D assets and learn Three.js at the same time, right? Because I appreciate that learning anything is hard. Learning two things at once is difficult. Well, you've got options for that too. So let's just abandon some of these changes. I'm a big advocate for something that's called Kitbashing. This is a concept of taking pre-rendered assets, whether they're paid or free, whether they come in a big kit or you just scour the internet for them. I think this is sort of related to photo bashing. You've probably heard of a similar concept. A lot of artists will grab a bunch of source images and like really roughly photo bash something together to give them an idea of what the finished product should look like. The same is true in 3D. So if you're not familiar with Blender or you don't want to make 3D models, you can still do cool stuff, right? I made grannies twerk in my browser at 11 o'clock on Saturday night, right? And I didn't make this model. I wasn't going to spend that much time modeling a granny twerking, but I could download one for free. So why would I not give it a go? And there's lots and lots of resources out there that will let you do that. Again, if you check out my stickers example, I do call out an artist who gives away a lot of his stuff for free. Kenny NL has a great bunch of sort of game-centric low poly assets. They're great for kitbashing, and some of them even featured in my walking simulator Hope. Or we could use a platform like Mixamo. This is sort of freely given out by Adobe. I don't know what the licensing is, so I would check that before using it in a commercial product. But these are free downloads, right? Just sign up for an Adobe account if you don't have one, and you can go through and select a bunch of characters here. For example, we have a standard humanoid here. This is so great for prototyping, right? You just download a humanoid and you're ready to go. But maybe I might want Mousy for some reason. Maybe I'm making a kid's game, and Mousy seems like the type of character that I'm going to have in my final version. So I'm going to grab him here. And then, I don't know, maybe we'll make Mousy do capoeira, speed it up a bit, right? So I don't have to learn how to do all of this. I can just download that file and use it immediately, right? That's really, really powerful. So please think about kitbashing before you, I guess, go on this journey. You don't have to make everything from scratch. And again, if we look in Blender here, my scene's quite simple. So I imported Granny. She didn't change. All I did actually was come in and add some lights because the scene was very dark and it was quite hard to see her. So I spent maybe 15 minutes just tweaking the lights because they don't come over quite perfectly. And as you can see, I've got a pretty fun result, I think. So some notes on that if you are going to do that. When we start playing animations, you again see there is a little bit more complexity involved. We're having to introduce this notion of a clock. Clocks are very high precision timers. If you're going to make something that's even remotely game-like, you're going to be using a clock anyway, probably for either doing your physics loops or maybe even just counting frames in between frames. So this will be present anyway in your experience. If it's not, it's very easy to add for an animation. We have to find the object that we want to play the animation on. We want to grab the actual animation out of the object. So this GLTF file has a bunch of properties. I'm not going to go through them all, but it does actually expose the animations in an array. So it's very easy to get to them. And then I have to play those animations. So for something like my stickers example, I went for a really lo-fi solution. I named every animation the same as the object that it was being attached to in Blender. And I literally just have a loop that goes through this animations array. It finds the object with the right name, attaches the two together and plays it. So while this is a very naive implementation, and you can imagine a lot of copy paste going on here, if you were going to add a lot of animations, it is extremely trivial to make a system that again sort of scales to your needs very quickly to just get you to muck around and sort of test and play. Obviously, if there's logic involved in when you want animations turned on and off, that's a different story. But to get you going, you really aren't adding much code at all. Again, the heavy lifting is we've set the camera here on line 51 and I've just added the granny in line 61. Those two things haven't actually changed. So I personally think this is a really sort of extensible workflow. So what would be some keys for success if you wanted to try and do this sort of tonight at 9 o'clock when all these talks are finished? The first thing I would say is please go check out my starter on GitHub. The link is down there at the bottom. I can share it in Slack afterwards. As I said, I've tried to make this as sort of starter friendly as possible. It's got all your hot reloading. It's got most of your configuration set up for you. Aside from that, the whole point of this talk is to really try to get you to realize that object loaders are the way to go, right? So please use object loaders as soon as you can. Feel free to muck around with the primitives while you're learning the basics, but as soon as you want to do anything, I guess, visually rewarding or anything remotely complicated, you're going to need to use them anyway. So you might as well start early. In fact, a really good first thing to do is rip the cube out of the demo and just load a cube out of Blender through an object loader, right? And just replicate that same flow. That's actually a really good way to learn how to use an object loader. Find a workflow that works for you. So the workflow I use, I intentionally choose to export a GLTF because I sort of, in my head, I'm mentally like, all right, I'm at a good point to export this and test it in the browser. But you might want to use a file format like FBX or something where you can just hit save in your 3D modeling application and it just hot reloads immediately. Like you can remove that export step if you want. I just choose to have it in there because I like to sort of mentally segregate those two tasks a little bit. I guess this is probably true of anything you're learning that's new, but invest in hot reloading as soon as you can. If you're mucking around trying to move things by like 0.001 units, or you accidentally don't select everything in Blender before you export it, or you do something dumb, if you have to stop the web server and start it or refresh the web page every time, that's going to get old really quickly. And it's going to really derail you from doing the fun stuff, because the fun stuff shouldn't actually be seeing it in the browser. Once you've got those basic lines of code, they should just work. And again, kitbash where possible. If we can have more twerking grannies in the browser, I think we'd all be better off. So that's me for today. That was a really high level talk. Again, this is just to say, if you don't know where to look with Three.js, maybe start at object loaders. If you haven't seen the content I put out, please go head over to scott.cab. I have a bunch of example projects on there that I do, as well as links to my game and of course my blog.